Okay, we're now going to move into lesson 9 of this chapter, and we're going to move into the text, chapter 5, sections 1 and 2. This deals with the Old West and interactions that we have out there. When we talk about the Old West, first of all, what we want to take a look at is the demographics of the area, or how the population is made up. From the Great Plains to the California desert, there were very few white settlers up until the time after the Civil War. All of that area had just been passed over. The white settlers moved through that territory, getting closer to the river valleys of the Pacific, in Oregon, in Washington State, in California, trying to find gold, trying to find farmable land. And so they moved through that vast area in the center of the nation, essentially because they believe that there's nothing that can be done with it. It's called the Great West, or the Great American Desert. After 1865, though, we begin to have a large influx of people moving into this area. A lot of that was because of the Homestead Act. A lot of that was Confederates who were trying to get away from the government. A lot of that was people who just wanted to make a fresh start. And so by 1890, we have a lot of states being formed in the area, when in 1865 there was nobody there. So this is a great quick period of change to come about in this area at the time. The area of the plains is inhabited by Plains Indians, which included groups like the Sioux and the Comanche. In the southwest, we have the Apache and the Navajo, and then in the northwest, we have the Shoshone and the Nez Perce tribes. Native Americans stood in the way of this expansion, not only as people moved through the area, but also once people started to settle the area. A lot of tribes were very against having whites move into the area permanently, but even moving through the area disrupted their culture and their lives, and Native Americans were angry about this disruption to their culture. They saw this as an unwanted influence in how their lives were conducted. It's interesting to note, though, that African Americans really take advantage of all of this open land to the west. 18% of California will be African American by 1890. Over 500,000 African Americans will live west of the Mississippi, and many of them moved to places like Arkansas and Texas as slaves. But after they are emancipated, they stay in those areas. After about 1877, about 200,000 blacks moved to the west. Many became homesteaders, and so you'll see pictures of African-American farmers on the Great Plains in the late 1800s, which is not something that we usually think about. It's usually the white settlers that we think about when talking about the Great Plains, but African-Americans took advantage of this new opportunity to make something for themselves. And an interesting note is that, according to current estimates, about 1 in 4, about 25% of all cowboys were African American. Cowboys were very low-paying jobs. It was a very tough life. But, you know, if you always hated working on the plantation before this, or if you wanted to get away from your family's inheritance of that 40 acres, then a lot of young male African Americans go out west and become cowboys. If you could ride a horse, you could become a cowboy and herd cattle and things like that. Speaking of the horse, it's really the horse that changes Native Americans' lives in the Central Plains quite a bit. The horse is not native to North America. The horse was brought here by the Spanish as early as the 1500s, and it's these free-roaming horses that have just absolutely multiplied and multiplied and multiplied out there on the plains that changes Native American lives. Native Americans learn to ride the horse. Native Americans find that by riding horses, they can more easily capture their prey, the buffalo. They can move over great distance and follow the herds more easily. And so very quickly, that 10,000-year-old culture of being nomadic but doing everything on foot really changes because of the introduction of the horse to the Great Plains. By 1860, there are estimates that there were tens of thousands of Native Americans on the plains, and that their society was formed in kind of a layered society. You have very large tribes that take over a large area of territory. Within those tribes, you have bands, and the bands would be about 500 or so men and women, and then those bands would be divided up into families. And so a chief would be in charge of a band, and there would be several chiefs who would make up a governing council for the tribe as a whole. Now, originally, the government doesn't pay much attention to Native Americans as people are crossing the plains. They try and defend settlers from Indian attacks as they go across. But other than that, they're seen as a nuisance, then they're seen as independent nations living on American soil. Once Americans want that territory, now the government policy has to change. And originally, when we moved tribes out of the eastern part of the United States, out of places like Florida, we just told them, go west of the Mississippi, and as long as you're west of the Mississippi, we don't care what you do. So you can have whatever land that you want, which does create quite a bit of problems for the Native Americans already living west of the Mississippi, but we didn't care. We just moved them out and told them whatever you want to do is fine with us. Once Americans start to move into that territory, though, and want that territory for themselves, now we have to do something with them. We don't have any land that we can move them to, and so what we do is we end up concentrating them into reservations. Eventually what we'll do is we'll create an Indian territory, which is today Oklahoma. But that Indian territory will be made up of all sorts of different tribes. And we just keep shrinking their land, shrinking their land, shrinking their land until there's nothing left. Now, Indian tribes were run by the government and were eventually, after being put on the reservations, couldn't fend for themselves. We wanted them to become farmers, and this was not their natural way of life. Their natural way of life was to be a hunter-gatherer kind of society. And so to stick them on a spot of land and say, this is yours, you own it now, and you need to use this land in order to grow crops, was a completely foreign idea to most of these Native Americans. And so what ends up happening is they fail quite miserably at doing this. And so the American government says, well, we need to support them. We need to teach them how to do this. And until they learn how to do this, we need to take care of them. And so they develop what is known as the bonus agent system in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA. The BIA is still around today and controls the interaction between the U.S. government and federal tribes. But back then, their job was to take care of Indians. And these BIA agents, known as bonus agents, were given just a sum of money and told to supply the Indians with what they needed. This leads to a lot of corruption because you're very far away from any ruling government, and nobody really cared about these Indian tribes. And so these bonus agents would use this money to buy supplies at the very lowest costs, and they were allowed to keep all of the excess money for themselves. That's why they were called bonus agents. They later on take on the nickname the bogus agents because they were so corrupt and because they treated the native tribes very poorly. They would buy the worst blankets available, often diseased blankets, and give them to the tribes. They would buy the smallest amount of food that they could. And so this leads to a lot of tension between Native American tribes and the U.S. government. Not only were we pushing them onto smaller sections of land, but we were also mistreating them once they were put on that land. And so the Indians begin to rebel, and that leads us into a lot of warfare between Indians and the U.S. government.